In this episode, we have three luminaries joining us: Zack Embree, Alan Boldon, and Stephanie Wang. This was a really cool combo that Julian and I put together. Some were from his orbit, some were from mine. And I thought that the cross global, we have people from all over the world. Each three of them had experiences working in business, in creativity, and I would say really up leveling their lives from very different perspectives. But there were so many common threads we were able to pull out. What were some of your favorite threads in this conversation?
Yeah, all of our luminaries have an impressive track record, but I feel like if you would individually look up these three, there's a lot. There's a lot there, and as you said, like the way they connected, even maybe not so obvious at first, but that became apparent throughout this 90-minute conversation. It just continuously blew my mind, And Ellen started a little more on the quiet end. I think I remember on that
Yeah,
day he was
yeah.
just recovering from a cold, but at the end he just dials it up. And I love these very dynamic conversations. This was definitely not just a breaking the rules conversation, but it was also a no bullshit conversation, which is one of those really refreshing elements of the series we've created together. Hope that when you have three, four, or five people share a round table, it gets increasingly harder to just talk about generalities, and people go all in, go right there, break the bullshit, break the rules. And so I love this conversation.
And I agree with you. And I know that after this conversation cut, they all emailed each other and said, "Hey, let's get together, let's collaborate, let's speak at another time." So not only are you going to witness their sparks between them, but know that this is leading to other connections down the road just from this conversation. We are breaking the rules of business as usual. Join this exclusive Alter Braintrust series with Hope and Julian.
My name is Julian. I'm here today with my co-host Hope. This series is called Breaking the Rules of Business as Usual. Welcome, Hope.
Thank you, Julian. Today we're here with Stephanie, Zack, and Alan. Welcome to the Alter Braintrust, where luminaries shed masks, get real, and unveil their unfiltered journeys, exploring the bold ways they break the rules of business as usual. Our world is changing faster than ever. Usual is out of the window. What does it take to thrive in 2024 and beyond? We can't wait to dive in with you all today. And I first want to ask you each a question. Zack, Stephanie, Alan, each of you have engaged with different realms. Zack in relationships, Alan in your art, Stephanie to plant-based wellness. How do each of you navigate societal norms and expectations to pioneer innovative paths in your respective fields? And what we really want to know is, what lessons have you learned from this about breaking away from the rules of business as usual? Stephanie, do you want to begin?
Sure. Social norms. That was, out of everything you said, how to break out of that, that was something that um, really hit me because I grew up in Hong Kong and in Chinese culture and in an upbringing that was conservative for sure. And there were very specific expectations of, okay, when you graduate, make sure you get a job, make money, don't be an artist, that's kind of um, programming. And I am, of course, entirely opposite to that. And yes, it served me well initially when I walked that path, and studied business and did all the practical things, and not to at all um, diminish or negate what my family upbringing was at all, but that my true, I would say, self really it was something so entirely different, to the point where when I realized that I had to leave Hong Kong entirely behind, I had to leave my family behind. I had to really delve into first in the arts. I actually went into film. I was even an actor for some period of time, just to break out of all the corporate programming, all of the cultural programming. And it was, an exercise that I was privileged enough to do, because I had the means, because I had a business background, and I had worked in investment banking before that. Um, but what was, I think, one of the most challenging things, but that ultimately what really led to where I am today, and to being fully aligned with, who I am, is really having to face so much of the shadow, um, a lot of the wounds, a lot of trauma that I didn't even know I had. And, I didn't even have language at that point in the beginning to even address it, because I didn't even know what I was feeling. And whatever I felt that it was normal to be always feeling diminished or small or depressed, um, and again, you add on that a culture that doesn't even recognize, so much therapy or anything like that. It was an interesting breaking out. So it was a tough journey, but it was definitely the turning point in my life that I had to go through, and it was a dark night of the soul. And I had to go all the way in order to come back out. But that in itself was exactly why I'm doing what I'm doing today, and why I've always been so passionate about conscious evolution and personal transformation. And in that process of healing, I found plants, and plant medicine specifically, psychedelic plants, psychoactive plants. And what was incredible was, it's not that suddenly I started doing plant ceremonies and then my life changed. It was that I had been doing a lot of foundational work before that, in my own self discovery and healing, and understanding the world, that when I met plant medicine, it really accelerated that whole process. And I'm so incredibly grateful for that. And it was through plant medicine that I actually was able to really experience, and especially in ceremony, particularly with psychedelics, but specifically with Kana, which is not psychedelic, because it is a plant that on a ceremonial dose, you really feel that oneness and connection and belonging and acceptance. And again, I'm not saying at all, and I think this is really clear. This is really important to clearly um, distinguish. There is no such thing as a magic pill. One has to walk, or everybody has to walk their own unique path. And I think that, even the idea of healing processes, people, it's so unique to each particular individual. And that if you're following someone else's footsteps, that's probably not the right path for you. And so much of this journey has been just realizing how worthwhile, excuse me, it is to constantly be pushing that boundary, and always listening to what my heart is saying, what my gut is saying. The mind actually comes much later, and is obviously helpful, but it is a journey of listening very closely to, yourself. It is wonderful to take advice from many people, but ultimately you're your own sovereign being, and actually understanding that and taking responsibility for that. So I feel like I'm starting to ramble.
You're not rambling at all, but you definitely had me at, you had to go all the way in to come back out again for your own sovereign journey, following your own intuitive voice. Thank you, Stephanie. And I wonder what sparks for you, Zach, in thinking about navigating societal norms and expectations for your own pioneering work.
Well, it's interesting. I think that uh, owing to a somewhat chaotic upbringing, I always found sort of that um, social norms were something that I maybe observed but didn't adhere to. And so I found myself very naturally a creative person my whole life. And yeah, finding myself sort of in this position where I was always creatively metabolizing the situation that I was in. And I think that really gave me an ability to create narratives and see meaning in places where people might often just sort of brush over it or through it, or maybe be a little bit more goal oriented. And I think that because I have this creative disposition, it allowed for me to become a little bit more process oriented. And so, this is, when you're young, and when I was young and in my 20s, it was really exciting and a lot of exploration. But I realized at different junctures in my life that taking the path less traveled really, the road can get quite rocky sometimes and quite confusing. And I think this is the path of any entrepreneur, really, who wants to strike out on their own. In my course in for coherent culture, we talk about the three levels of mind, the three plateaus of mental models that we tend to work in. And one is the socialized mind. And when we're in the socialized mind, we tend to be thinking kind of black and white about things. When we're in the self authoring mind, is when we start to actually break down and get a lot more aligned with our principles. And when we're in the self-transforming mind, we have much more ability to actually sort of empathize with where other people are at, and also essentially guide our own actions based on our own principles, and really develop a deep sense of truth and presence. And so my life has very much been, I guess, that process, sort of playing by the rules, finding that didn't work, experimenting with sort of my own models for reality and for how to care for myself, and then moving into, I think I'm there, and I peek into places where pure possibility is present, like where our actual truth. I think that, one of the things when we talk about where we're at right now in terms of society and breaking the rules of society is breaking down a shared truth. It becomes very difficult to have a socialized mind in a context where there's no longer a shared truth. So we see this sort of fracturing into fragments everywhere. And so, we tend to, I think because we're tribal beings, we're kind of pack animals. We try and find the people that we agree with and, galvanize ourselves against the world. And this, to me, is the big issue that we're facing right now, is this reversion to a tribalism where we're willing to assume that we are sort of the righteous ones, whoever it is that we might choose to surround ourselves with. I think en masse what's going on is people are aggregating into these clumps where they believe that they have access to the truth. Other people do not, and are willing to wage war in various ways. That could be in the form of just sort of cancellation of someone, of essentially just belittling sort of their take and their humanity, all the way to what we see going on in the Middle East and Ukraine and beyond. So it's a continuum. I think this process of, where am I going with this? So because we're entering into these sort of tribal factions right now, and the grand narrative society are breaking down, it's forcing people into a place where they must connect with their own truth and their own humanity. And when we do, and this is why I do what it is that I do, is because I really believe that relationship is the route to actually learning how to collaborate again, learning how to create again, because when we no longer have big grand narratives that hold us together, we actually have to get to something deeper, which is our humanity and our desire to create together. We no longer have the luxury of being able to attach to this big cruise ship of a grand narrative. We actually have to kind of start working together and rowing the boat together. And, we no longer have access to the big diesel engines that were driving us. We got to put our oars in the water and start paddling. And not only that, but we have to decide where we're going. And so these, the skills to do this is what has really, during my years of working as a sort of activist photographer, I've seen a lot of social movements happen. And I've seen the way that it's very easy for people to find what it is that they don't want. But finding what it is that we want is incredibly challenging and is a huge opportunity. And I think this comes about through being able to understand oneself, relate to another, and then learn to collaborate. And that's really what brought me to the work that I do now.
And Zack, I'm going to take your creative metabolism. That for me is a very clear line through, and I'm sure that Alan, in your work, there is a whole lot of creative metabolism going on. Am I right in saying that? In your breaking the rules, societal norms?
Maybe, I don't know. I'm yet to metabolize that metaphor, but it's great questions, and really it's interesting to hear everybody. I don't think I've done too well with social norms, and I suspect maybe a bit like you were both saying, Zack and Stephanie. My youth had an awful lot of violence, and so that was very difficult, very traumatic. And to an extent, I had to sort of step out of some of the social situations I was in just to sort of get away from the difficulties. I'm sure that contributed to me not always participating in social norms comfortably. I think there were other reasons. I think some sort of deep nature connection where very early on where I didn't really see a distinction between myself and the outside world. And I was just thinking as I was listening to you, Zack, I know a lot of people who talk about sort of self and looking after self and other and planet. And I'd flip that right round. I'm not sure about this. The focus on self is right, but I think participating in something greater is sometimes when I find a version of myself that feels most exciting. I think that maybe the social norms are so restrictive, be this, do this, act like this is the script. And it's I think you used the word diminished, Stephanie, and I think that diminishes everybody who participates in it, that kind of script. So I think I was, don't know what really in a way why I was drawn to art, but it was one of the things that sort of came relatively easy to me. But I don't think it was just that. I think I don't necessarily feel like art actually has come that easy to me, but I think it asks one of a version of a sort of definition of art that works for me, and it's not about all art, but it's that art should disturb our habits of thinking and being. And so I think, when you're talking about social norms, I think that's where maybe art can come in.
I like it. There's lots of head bobbing going on as you say this, Alan. Art disturbs social norms, right? And Stephanie used the word diminish, and Alan, you picked up on it. The social norms diminish kind of the individual spark, Zack, that you also talked about, right? This understanding of who we are. I'd love to go just a level deeper right away here. This has been a good opening. This is going to be a a tough topic to navigate. But Stephanie, you're already doing so well at that with Ka and pathogenics and bringing out like a whole new revolution. And so mind-altering substances, classically have a lot of stigma with them. Whoever wants to share, right? Maybe there have been breakthrough moments in your lives when those kind of substances were involved. And then also, how do we navigate that space in a mindful way and in a way where we become aware that we're not just partaking in a culture there, we're actually forming a new social norm, maybe, right? Or we're inviting people into a space to understand so much more is possible, but actually here you have to be responsible, resilient, and understand yourself and others. And it's not a prescriptive kind of way to operate. Stephanie, you want to take it from there? I feel like you have lots to say about this specific topic.
Yes, I actually do. It's funny, and thank you for mentioning like we're creating a new social norm, because what we're also seeing in the psychedelic renaissance is often, and again, depends on each person, but we have a bit of a danger of creating another social norm in which it becomes just a trend or something else that people actually escape into. You can keep doing psilocybin journeys, you can keep doing ayahuasca, and all you're doing is chasing cosmic entertainment. You can do that. You actually can. But the cool thing about plant medicines, though, particularly, and I think I will speak more to the non-synthetic, the more organic-based plant medicines, instead of things like LSD or MDMA, just because I'm more familiar with the plant-based side, is that these are teachers of truth, and there's a reason why these plants have been so intertwined with so many indigenous cultures around the world, and how they have served both for societal curative purposes, divination purposes, spiritual worship, but just day to day as well. And so there is an element that is entheogenic, where when you are partaking when you're actually communing with these plants and sitting with them in a journey, that it takes you out of the ordinary consciousness. It brings you to a new awareness, like I said before, in an accelerated way. So yes, it can be very sort of truthy, as one of my friends would say when they're like, I can only handle one ceremony. It's just too truthy. I can't handle the truth. And, that's actually a really good thing, because it also, there is a tendency, therefore, for people who seek it for, other reasons, that they quickly realize that's not the way to go. So built in, there's that mechanism with a lot of these sacred teaching plants like ayahuasca, psilocybin, white chuma, you know, peyote, I guess even, and it's different. It's helpful in that sense. Having said that, what is really also super cool is that besides the psychedelic renaissance, there's also a psychoactive, psychedelic adjacent thing happening with a lot of other plants that are being rediscovered. They've always been there. They've been used again by human beings for thousands of years. It's just that most people in modern society have just just have not had the chance to access that knowledge. And now, what's beautiful is that all of these plants, including kana, and many others, are being rediscovered. And what I think you were saying, in terms of how to work with them, the biggest thing is, I think, go into it understanding that you're what I feel that you can get the most out of is when you really respect that process of what you're putting yourself through, and what the relationship, speaking of relationships, that you are now building with this particular plant. So definitely, work with someone who is a trusted facilitator. Do not just randomly do it like as if it was recreational, whatever. I mean, again, people do that, that's fine, but to really understand who you're meeting and how to work with it in integrity, finding a good facilitator, setting, of course, the mindset that you bring to it, the intentionality that you bring to this, and also the setting and the environment. So do you want to do it in a crowded, I don't know, rave? Maybe not. Maybe you want to sit with it really intentionally by yourself to really explore what there is. And of course, any relationship depends on what you put in. What you put in is what you get out. And it's hard for human beings to think of plants as something you come into relationship with. But therein lies sort of a big aspect of regenerative culture. It's like, well, why do we need to respect 100% of life? Because we are a part of 100% of life. We are part of nature. We are not the dominant element of nature. We are one of the elements, and that for us to thrive, even if that's all we're interested in, in the long term, and we're already seeing, the consequences of not doing that right now in the world. If we want to thrive in the long term, we do have to take into consideration our relationship with each other and with the rest of the beings that are on the planet, and the planet itself. So this is a long way around of saying, when you go into a relationship with sacred plants, you're meeting a sentient being, and especially the psychoactive and psychedelic plants, which are even more obvious, you know, um, in a way, because they are sacred teaching plants. That is much more obvious. But to understand and kind of go into it in the right attitude. And the more you can do that, the more benefit you will get from that. And again, what they're doing is they're actually teaching us to come back into being what it means to be human, what it means to be connected to the world and to the rest of life.
I think one of our first conversation around the fire outside, Zach, in Quebec, freezing cold outside. We're dipping in and out of sauna and freezing plunges into a pond. I discovered that you had been using sacred plants in some of your work coaching people.
Mm-hmm.
And you had shared some realizations around using sacred plants and medicine with me. And I wonder if you could share kind of where you're at in weaving them into your work, or perhaps share your perspective in light of Stephanie's.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with psychedelics, psychedelic itself means mind revealing. And, what Stephanie was referring to around this, what I heard in what she was sharing was this feeling of connection to something greater, this feeling of connection to the planet, to spirit, to a form of consciousness that seems outside of ourselves. And I certainly have had those experiences. I believe that part of it actually is part of what's so powerful about the psychedelic experience or working with plant medicines is the depth of connection to self. And the reason why they're discovering now with some of the latest research, this is particularly coming out of Johns Hopkins, and then also, I believe it's King's University in London. They have been studying what the effect neurologically is of psilocybin, of using mushrooms. And they're finding that areas of the brain that correlate to our mental models of self and the world actually are getting less blood flow during psilocybin journeys. And so what this is doing is it's forcing the brain to work around sort of these models and get into presence again. And I think that that's what's so transformative. This is why I totally agree with you, Stephanie. It's so important to be in the right container in order to get the full benefit of the healing from these medicines. Because what's going on for you is you're actually opening up into a deeper, into a developmental age that might be correlated to when you're 4, or when you're, usually it's like 4 and under. For many people, when they experience psychedelics, there is an experience, or plant medicines, there is an experience of awe, of just actually taking in the world and seeing the beauty of it again, in a way that maybe they haven't seen in 20 years or 30 years. And what that is actually a developmental stage opening up again. You're actually imprinting your mind and your body and your emotional apparatus at a very deep level. And so it is important to be with a guide that you trust, that you have an established relationship with, and that there's some continuity there. Because I think a lot of people see these experiences as silver bullets, as magic pills. And I totally agree with you, Stephanie. There's no magic bullet here. It's very easy to turn these experiences into entertainment. What's revealed in these incredible moments is the work that we need to do. And so this is how I incorporate it into, when my clients have these insight experiences, then what's revealed there is where the work is. And then it's all about creating the disciplines and the patterns in order to act on the insight that we receive. It's so easy to receive the insight, feel the dopamine rush, feel the warm fuzzies from actually seeing what's possible. And then we just go back into our default patterns. And then we just chase that experience again and getting elevated. And that's when sort of the sacred opportunity for healing becomes more of a recreational use of drugs. And so I believe that it's very exciting, this time that we're in right now in the psychedelic renaissance. However, just like everything that we're in right now, it's a razor's edge. So the way that AI may power, an incredible new golden era in what's possible for humans, it also has incredible peril that is just as possible, and requires all of us to be very mindful of how we move forward with the AI technology. The same is true for psychedelics. I think that this creating a culture where people are able to connect to a greater framework of healing and healing through relationship, because that's where we're held to account, is when other people perceive our actions and other people are able to give us feedback on where we're at, how we're showing up, because we develop our own blind spots. During the psychedelic experience, our awareness can get into our blind spot, but often then the door shuts on that. And this is why it's so important to be in a relationship with a professional or with a group that is committed to growth in a deep way, and in a way that's fair, that honors sovereignty and self-discovery and choice, and also offers frameworks for better understanding and for rapid development of insight and application of that in our lives. Did I? Yeah.
You did.
Yeah.
You did indeed. And Alan, I wonder if you had any experiences or any thoughts on navigating sacred plants as a guide in our human lives, or as a connection point in our human lives for growth and discovery.
No, not really. Nothing significant. So I'll leave this bit of the topic to the others who have.
Well, I wonder if I have a word that came from Stephanie that I loved, truthy. The word truth is a pretty loaded word, as many words are. And I often think about that word as a parent. Speaking of doing our own work, for me, I'm a parent of two, and I'm often thinking about the work as a human, as a parent, to show up in truth, to embody truth. I wonder what truthy, how it lands with you, Alan, in your work.
Well, I'll try a couple of angles at that. So the only thing that struck me as I was listening, particularly to Stephanie, was so a lot of my work is a kind of place-based learning, trying to learn from places, and I bring lots of different people together who have brilliant ways of getting to know a place. And to an extent, what we try and do is inhabit their way of engaging with a place. And I think possibly what emerges, what emerges is a whole range of very, very significant experiences. It feels like both the experience of trying to deeply engage with someone else and how they come to know the world and the place, and then moving between these different ways of knowing and trying to hold all of the different experiences and combine them, because it seems to me that however brilliant people are there, they're offering a partial glimpse mostly. And what we try and do is then combine those different glimpses to get a fuller view. And I wouldn't usually say we're trying to find truth, but I think that might speak to that question a little. Trying to get a fuller view. I mean, if I'm talking to young people, I think the Moomins is a great place to go for a bit of truth.
The Moomins, did you say?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, I remember that book. I don't know if everybody else has seen it. Yeah.
Oh, well, I was thinking of the books. I don't know. Maybe there were programs as well. But the Hemulin who loved silence. I'm sure there's a lot of truth in there. But I had another thought, but it's gone.
I like the play space. I happen to have traveled around the world with my children, and so they do have a lot of frameworks, a lot of perspectives of landing in various cultures with various people. And I think landing back in North America, they're seeing one angle of the truth, and that's been really revealing to see a young brain say, out loud, there seems to be all these different truths that are landing all over the world. How do we make sense? How do we make sense of this?
Yeah.
If I may add, I'm so sorry, Alan. Please go ahead. Please, I don't want to interrupt.
No. Go for it, Stephanie. Please.
No, in terms of what you were saying earlier, Zach, about after sort of post these experiences. I mean, a lot of these experiences are about finding truth. They're about, going, oh, wow, what I thought was one thing is now not. But then is that even real? And then you need to test it out, right? And so one of the biggest things with plant medicines is the integration part. And most people are very engaged in the journey itself, which is 5 to 6 hours worth. Or 15 minutes if you're doing 5-MeO DMT. But really, it's about afterwards, what are you going to do with those insights, and how that's where the rubber meets the road. And I think, when Alan and Hope, you were talking about truth, that's where we find truth, right? And there are, absolutely, everybody has their own truth, but how we exist together in this realm, having the courage to test those truths, having the courage to come into relationship with other people, to participate in life, is actually part of that creative metabolism, I feel. And what I find is that often when we all feel isolated, depressed, not seen, because of all the conditioning and the social norming, is that we don't think that we cannot value our own contribution in creating this mosaic, which is, by the way, life itself. It's a beautiful blossoming of life. That is where the rubber meets the road, is that if we can integrate whatever our experiences are, and it doesn't even have to be through plant medicine, it could be through art, that truth, whatever you think it is, test it out. Test it take it out for a drive, put the sweater on, see what it looks like. Just that in itself is so important. And I think where we are in society at the moment is just demoralization of just thinking, I'm not even going to try because it just doesn't, who cares, number one, and everything is going to pot. So why would I even do it? Because it's just not going nowhere. And I think that is, I think for all of us, whether we're artists or entrepreneurs, it is really important to get the message out that each of us, whatever we are, whoever we are, to have the courage to be and to then align with ourselves to do and to show up in the world that way. To me, that's the only way we can elevate ourselves going forward.
Beautifully said. I find there's a very interesting red thread between the three of you and what's kind of been emerging in this conversation so far, and that is, Hope and I frame it as breaking the rules, right? Breaking the rules of business as usual. And really, we're seeing there's a cultivation of maybe new cultural norms that's coming through the work of all three of you, right? And they're all relationship based. If it's place-based relationship to specific locations where the earth might talk to us, where maybe more is possible, right? If it is relationships with, plants or gateways, plants can be gateways in that sense. And I love the depth with which you all address this. I think it's very important to contextualize it like that. Or if it is also the relationship we have with ourself and then witnessed again through the group. Zach, I found this fascinating because if it's only the self, we can kind of go back into the delusion of making up who we are. Really, we need the feedback loop of others, right? We're social beings. And so it's kind of this interestingly paradoxical interplay between the two of them. I'd love to just continue that and dive a bit deeper, what it really requires to be a pioneer of this and to find groups and places like this. Alan, I know you've been really deeply involved with cultivating those places all over the world and with bringing people together. And Stephanie and Zach, specifically for you both, it's this relationship, right? This idea of understanding self and others and bringing people together into constellation. I want to address one specific piece here as a question, and that's loneliness. I think a lot of us have either faced that or suffered from it. I think in society at large, it's rampant. We're more connected than ever through our technological devices, but yet there is this phenomena of loneliness, maybe even meaninglessness or purposelessness. How do you all deal with that? And how do you build your resilience and capacity for navigating the darker spaces? And whoever feels called first, just let's have an alive conversation here.
Well, I can pick up on that. I do think that, these grand narratives that society, the stability of our society has been built on grand narratives and a consensus reality. And as we see that start to fragment more, then the experience in the self is also more and more fragmented. And so I actually see it as like this loneliness. It's so fascinating that, through the COVID lockdowns and all of this, I mean, there's been this for many people across the world in exquisitely forced sort of loneliness. And so if we're to see this as serving something, as serving, forcing us to actually, maybe for me, if I could speak, to speak personally to it, the isolation of the lockdowns really forced me to get present with the darkness and this feeling of emptiness that I think had been in me my whole life, but I had never slowed down enough to get really present to. And when I slowed down to get really present to it, it was in many ways devastating. I mean, it was very difficult actually to experience that depth of just feeling lost, not being able to connect to purposeful action. And so, I think what this did is it forced me to engage in my purpose at deeper and deeper levels. So, I felt like I was connected to my purpose, but then when this forced loneliness happened, I realized that there were still some areas that I was unconscious of. I wasn't really choosing. I was still on autopilot. And so it forced me into the dark of myself, and like going into a dark place anywhere, suddenly it can be full of your own projections. When you got to go into the basement and there's no lights on, it's very easy to imagine a bunch of, like monsters down there. And often they're just figments of your own imagination, but you have the experience of that possibility. And so, going into that darkness of the self, the dark night of the soul, and actually going on that adventure, really, because it is like you're going into the unknown. of the self, I feel like it actually allowed me to get to deeper underpinnings of who I am and what I'm up to and what I want my life to be about, in terms of me channeling my life energy into something useful. I think we do have this, like, it's an incredible opportunity to feel like you can, like, to know that you are channeling your life into something useful, that's beneficial, that's bringing more harmony to the world as opposed to entropy. And so, kind of getting back to breaking business as usual and this inflection point that we're at with society, I actually think this is part of the danger that we're in too, is a lot of people are feeling that emptiness, and there's a lot of manipulation going on right now to draw people into a sense of meaning by engaging in these wide sweeping sort of social movements, political movements, whatever. There's a lot of different, it could be consumer movements even, I don't know, but these are concepts that flatten the experience of the self, and then essentially draw it into sort of this collective concept. So it's a way of escaping oneself again. And I'm seeing that happen a lot. And so this is, again, why I actually think it's really important for people to develop their intimacy with themselves so that they can actually connect to something deeper, more heartfelt, more true. Because the truth, I think, in order to land on it, one needs to be a scientist. And to be a scientist is to always ask the question, to always test your hypothesis, always test the model that you're working in. It's not about finding the truth. It's about the process towards the truth, which is really important. And so when people get drawn into these sort of mass narratives again, you can recognize them because they come across as completely righteous and completely fundamental. They're the fundamentalist. And that's, to me, like, of all of the things that are happening on the planet right now, for me, that's the most concerning.
Yes, I agree.
Can I add a little thought to that? So I was staying with the word truth, and I'm pleased with where you went with that, Zach. Because I was thinking in science, I've worked with a lot of scientists, and they look at approximate truths, contingent truths, as you say, sort of just asking a question, usually getting a negative answer, and just slightly, nudging forward a working model of how things might work. Sometimes there are breakthroughs, there's sort of the great Thomas Kuhn-like, leaps in understanding. And I also thought of James Hillman, a psychologist who I was, really influenced by, got to meet a couple of times, but he was sort of suspicious of aha moments in therapy, and it's like the psychoanalytic kind of paradigm. I still think there's lots of great stuff that happens in psychoanalysis, but there's this idea, popular idea at least, that, if you get to that primary trauma and, rediscover it, then it all will be revealed and its power will be diminished. And it's kind of, there we are. And so he was a bit suspicious of that. And he was also a big fan of Gaston Bachelard, and me too, this idea of second reading. I don't know if you know it, but Bachelard, who said when you read a book, you're often pulled by the plot to find out what happens. But in the second reading, you already know. So you can luxuriate in the construction, in the characters, in the atmosphere. You can hang out. Sometimes I read a book just to meet that person again and just get to know them a little more. And I think sometimes those kind of revelatory experiences can feel like an aha moment, but it seems to me that again, it might be a partial glimpse, and there might be many, many ways to look at what felt like a revelation, and maybe bits of meaning will be released over time as we revisit those significant experiences, rather than everything being revealed at once, which might not be easy to take on board. And what you were saying about fragmented grand narratives, I also feel there's something there about metaphor, and a sort of diminished notion of metaphor is that something simply stands in for something else, rather than metaphor opening out into multiple possible meanings. And And I think, sadly, and you talked about fundamentalism, I think back to many of the great religious traditions from all over the world, if they're reduced into a kind of commodified package that's easy to get, it's the stories are, in all of those traditions, are much richer and may take a lifetime to even gain a tiny bit of a sense of what the meaning might be. But I think, a lot of people are quite willing to sell us quick access to truth. But I think that's a hollow literalism that won't sustain. So, but I do think that's the commodity on offer, and it will not sustain.
I'm thinking about, Julian, the word of loneliness. It's definitely been coming up in my world, working with entrepreneurs, working with people, working alongside children. And you mentioned the word personal intimacy, Zach. And I wonder, the three of you, how you cultivate a sense of we're talking a lot about the work and making sense of the world and truth, how you cultivate this personal intimacy, coming to solitude, reading those books again and finding those characters that weave stories into your life or meaning. How do you, the three of you and Julian, how do you cultivate that personal intimacy in a world where our attention is being vied for, things are being sold, ideologies are being spread? How do we come back to ourselves? I'd love to hear.
Earlier when we were on the topic of loneliness, the way that I'm seeing it is that we've put the cart before the horse. We have this amazing technology that is connecting us more than ever, but because of, again, social norms, back to that, and breaking through that, of what it means and what is accepted as normal human behavior, we have basically been disempowering ourselves, consistently, by thinking it's more important, let's say, to finish and do this work instead of spending that extra hour with family. Or I'm just giving a very basic example. And because I myself suffer from this, because it's so hard. We're living in such a busy world that demands our attention all the time, right? So how do we find that intimacy? How do we come back to what it means to be human? And I think developing those human relationships, that sounds so basic, but that's where it's at, because we literally have been disempowering ourselves, giving away our power to whatever the social media connection is, instead of meeting someone out, outside for a coffee instead. Or, those ways of being and what does it mean? And there's nothing that beats that. And I can tell you that in order to, for me, because I work intense hours as an entrepreneur, I will find myself, like, in order to come back to that, in order to come back to my own humanity, I have to just put stops into everything so that I can break out and self-disrupt. Otherwise, it is so easy, given the way technology is, given the way that our mind works. It's like, oh, I can do this faster. I'll do more of it because I'm actually doing more. And I feel like I'm gamifying myself. The system is giving me a game to play. And because we're human beings, we're easily susceptible to that. So like, oh, faster, more, gain more points, more rewards. I can do more shopping, whatever it is. But before you can come into that intimacy and actually trusting yourself enough to show up in a place to meet someone else in their integrity and you in your integrity, I think that spiritual development, personal growth, that work has to be done, because without a good sense of self, I think Zach was touching on that before as well, it's really hard because it's so easy just to get swept up in whatever the next trend is. And in order to find that strength to say, oh, you know what, that's actually, I don't necessarily agree with that. but I'm good where I am. I don't need to attack somebody else because I don't agree with them. I'm just going to hold my peace and do my thing over here. And I think this age is really requiring us to step up as human beings, to do that work, to look at the trauma we don't want to look at, to look at the shadow parts of ourselves, and to really process that and to really heal that as much as we can in order to thrive. And I will add one thing, because we haven't talked about this, is free will. And, at the end of the day, you either take responsibility for yourself or not. And if you don't, it's very easy to just get recruited essentially for whatever it is. And because you're like, oh, so and so said so, and I'm like, oh, I think that's a good, okay, let's go there, right? Without having done that self-exploration. And this always, is interesting because I think in order not to fall into the trap of more separation and us versus them, we have to also respect that there are people who will choose otherwise. And that's the world, and that's fine. I'm sorry about this long-winded way of going back to intimacy, but that in order to have that personal intimacy, you have to take responsibility for yourself, right? And in order to do that, you do have to wake up. So it's to me, it's all related.
Well, yeah, well, the relationship to the self. So two things come to mind. So just sort of picking up on where Stephanie left off is I think that around personal responsibility, an incredibly powerful coaching tool that I learned from the woman who developed it, Byron Katie, is the work, is 4 questions. And whenever I find myself tempted to blame others for a situation that I'm experiencing or for an upset that I've experienced, I use the work, which is asking, is it true? So is the thought that you're having true? Can you know for certain it's true? Who do you believe, or who are you? How do you act when you believe this thought? Who would you be without this thought? And essentially it's a form of CBD, cognitive behavioral therapy, but it's to me, it's a really powerful, succinct tool that no matter what is going on, brings the locus of control back to the self, back to the free will, that we actually do have choices around how we perceive the phenomena of our lives. So that's a really powerful coaching tool that I like, and I like to use often. I like to introduce others to. And then I would say, in terms of developing my own sort of intimacy, with self and with like, how do I reconnect with my core? Lately, I've been finding cold water exposure incredibly powerful. And it's because it requires, like, I really don't like it at all. It's freezing cold. I mean, like, up here in BC, there's like glacial runoff rivers that we go to cold plunge in. So this is like 2-degree water that's rapidly moving. Like, it is just like absolutely like just vacuuming heat out of your body. And then we're in there for, some people stay for 10 minutes. I can't do it. But to me, actually just facing my own resistance and then also facing my reaction, and then actually asserting calm in moments where my body wants to freak out, to me is like actually accessing my animal self, which is like kind of like my primitive self. And I can develop a relationship with that. And it forces that relationship to come into immediacy. And to me, that's what's really powerful about that practice. So, and it's so funny because that's how Hope and I met too, is jumping into cold. That pond is actually, it's a spring. So it was like quite cold groundwater coming up.
It'd make it easier that there was a sauna on the other end, because without the sauna and that brace, that shock, bringing you back to your breath is really fundamental. Yes. Oh. And Alan, I wonder for you, how do you connect back with yourself? What are some of the ways for you?
Oh, with myself. I was thinking about the question of loneliness, and yeah. So I'm big fan of the Buddhist teacher Thich Nhat Hanh, and he said we're here to awaken from the illusion of our separateness, and that separateness feels like a lonely place. And but I also think about resonance and dissonance, because I think sometimes it can feel as if one's lonely, well, so connection must be about identifying in others something that feels like me. But again, I think there can be such a desire for that we may leap too soon. And sometimes dissonance is super important to attend to. And again, I just feel like I'm quoting other people, but this is my sort of, I was really influenced by this philosopher, Hans-Georg Gadamer, who said when we meet others, we don't really get the chance to meet them. We get the chance to encounter our own prejudices. And in those sort of little dissonances, how can they think like that? How do they think that's normal? How do they think that's common sense? And for him, even your sort of postdoctoral research or whatever would be a prejudice. It's a filter. But he did say, if we then, and I wonder if it's a bit like the work. I don't know the work, Zach, but what he said is, we can then sort of look at how we don't quite connect with that other person and sort of say, well, how have my prejudices been put in place? How's my worldview been constructed? And if the other person is also doing that, then he says there is a slim chance we come back, and strange term for me at least, but he says a fusion of horizons is possible. But I do think that might be a way also to think about intimacy, that it can be very difficult to say the thing that isn't sort of like mirroring or reflecting, like, oh yeah, I totally get you. Yeah, I feel that as well. To say instead, I don't know what the hell you're talking about, or I don't know what that means, or, I don't feel like that. Oh, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know what's going on here. To go down that awkward path. But the possibilities of, at a certain point, then kind of think, oh, I think we might have just had a little glimpse of each other.
Do you do that, Alan? Are you brave enough when you're in conversation and the horizons are not synergistic and you say, hang on a minute, what are you talking about? Or you call out the elephant in the room, you're like, I completely don't agree with you. Do you do that?
I do that quite a bit. Yeah.
He did that just earlier before we hit recording. My face was like, there's a sound in the background, and he was like, Julian, what's going on with you over there? Right? And I actually really appreciated it. It shows me that you're paying attention to something that maybe others would skip over. I actually want to touch on what Alan just said, because it's quite interesting, looking the way I look, which is quite Germanic European, and I've always traveled through Latin America and speak Spanish since the age of 15. And there are so many moments when someone sees me and they're like, yeah, that guy doesn't speak Spanish. He looks like a gringo. And then they treat me with this way. And, it's usually at this point, it's quite funny. And so I like let it happen. And then I just show back that I'm not faced by that judgment or label, because it's, quite obviously I get it. But I reply with the most polite and best Spanish I could muster or foster in the moment. And it breaks this first layer of dissonance, it just shatters it. And there's like a little moment, a little glimpse of connection. And Latin American people at large, I'm generalizing, they're so good at being in their heart. So the moment you show that willingness to connect through language and just, kind of wipe away, or even sometimes I make the obvious and it's like, I get it, I look like a gringo to you, don't I? And then we just laugh, and it happens to me all over Latin America. And it feels like such a gift to lean into the dissonance and allow another form of resonance to come out that, to be honest, it's really hard to control that resonance. Like, I don't know where it goes. Maybe 1 out of 100 people, and I don't even remember it, is like, what an idiot. But I try to play with it, because I don't want to conform with whatever label or judgment or layer is kind of upon us there. And I found that interesting that you mentioned it. It's very much a lived experience over here. And I'm sure all of you have versions of that, right? And there's a few more of those that were shared. One was rereading a book. I do want to touch on that in a second. But then also cold exposure. Zach, it's like the coolest thing to do right now. But really, at the same time, it's one of the most real things to do, right? You said it. Like, I've lived in BC, I've gone into that cold ocean, and I hated it every single time. But there's a connection point within myself that I know I will get there 3 minutes in. And trust me, 5 minutes in, I'm out of the water. I'm not one of those that needs to stay for 15 minutes just to show how tough I am. But I know it's going to happen. So waiting those 3 minutes and breathing through it and just being there for that moment, I know will make me proud later on, even though 5 minutes prior, my mind is looking for every single excuse not to do it. Right? And then lastly, I want to touch on rereading books. So this is my generation and younger, but ultimately everyone. Harry Potter has probably gotten its way around the world. I've reread Harry Potter, I think 4 or 5 times in different languages to kind of expand my language learning through it, because I know the plot, right? So I can maybe pick up some new words and whatever, Spanish, Portuguese, English, whatever it may be, from my native German, which I've also read it in. And it's funny because I've once spent time with a client of mine. We were in person, and in the in-between, there's like a 5-day immersion. I would go and read Harry Potter, and he'd be like, "What are you doing? Like, this is not productive time." And I'd be like, "Whatever, man. I don't feel judged, but I feel like I want to be bored, and I want to explore this familiarity with these characters." And I think there's something about being royally bored and allowing oneself to do a whole lot of nothing that, at least for me personally, is kind of counter this norm of needing to always be productive, always do the best thing, always do something I can show for, always do something I can present to you. Look what an amazing guy I am, right? And for me personally, doing a lot of nothing allows me to do very big things, especially energetically speaking, because it allows the kind of the rubber band to pull into one direction, and then suddenly you release and it slingshots. Can you all relate to that in one way or other? And Hope, I want to invite you to also touch on that.
Yeah, I'm going to weave younger people in again. We did talk a lot about our digital world we're living in. But many of us lost in the digital, lost in that pull into this whole immersive world, whether it be AI, games, social media. And I'm really consciously thinking about how little boredom there is in many young people's lives, like none in some cases. And I think about how much time Alan and I grew up in England, spending, all weekend long just using my imagination, exploring outside, playing, getting dirty in nature.
Because England was so boring, you had to find stuff to do.
It was so boring, but we were all bored together. And with that boredom, opened up these portals of imagination, these story threads that I still can come back to. I don't have to read the books. I have my story threads that I used to pull on with my brother James. He's an artist now, and he's still pulling on some of these characters, these made up words. I mean, I'm a real, ask Julian, I love to make up my own words to make sense and to play with language. I do. And I feel this sense of loss of boredom, loss of imagination in younger people, actually at large. And I find I'm constantly finding ways, this is my way of connecting with people, is to be in presence with them, kind of open up space, remove the digital, and whether it be by a fire or going for a long wet walk outside and just seeing what conversations flow out. This time with the 3 of you, we don't have structured questions and this is the format. We're flowing with each other. And I just think often about the play and the imagination that we could and we can insert into the world. I'm definitely trying my best over here in Canada. And I wonder how you infuse play, infuse imagination in your lives. I'd love to hear. I'd love to get some ideas and add to my recipe. I have a feeling, Zach, I've seen you online playing with people looking for relationships. I'm call you out on this because I'm talking about as a mother and thinking about younger generations and children. I'm not in the dating world, but you and I talked about how this is missing in some ways in the world of dating, and I see you doing this, and I love
Thanks. Yeah, that's a thread I can pick up on. But I also want to just reflect back. You know, a friend of mine has an 11-year-old. I remember chatting with him. I was like, "Oh, why don't you read a book?" He's like, "Well, I don't want to read a book because I can't see what's going on." And I thought, my God, what is going to be the net impact of a generation that hasn't been forced through boredom to actually tap into that deeper self that can conjure and imagine and visualize. And it's interesting, I guess, like if we get into the realm of dating and connection, you know, my partner and I recently launched a workshop series called Heartcore because we wanted to take online sort of like dating and ways in which people are navigating their relationships and bring them in person. So it's for couples and for singles, but it's really a way of actually getting into a room together, which is novel to begin with, but also to share some basic sort of psychological frameworks, coaching frameworks for communication, but then embody it. So we actually use, you know, I think the best way to get into play is through the body, you know, whether it's like sort of the intensity of cold exposure, going for a hike. For me, honestly, like I love riding my bike. When I'm riding my bike, I tap into a whole other sense of self. I think I can forget myself. And I think in some ways, maybe that's what play is forgetting oneself and getting into and trying on something new. So that could be sort of through the act of just embodiment in a sport, but it could also be in the form of taking on other characters. You know, I find myself like I like to mimic things. So I'll often mimic characters and stuff like that, like just a way of being playful. In life in general. I try to have as much fun with it as possible. And so I tend to like to surround myself with people who are playful as well. Because yeah, life is so serious. But I actually think that you can get to you can get quite truthy when you get into play with life, you know, like you can kind of get to a deeper, I don't know, maybe there's something mammalian about it. You know what I mean? Like just being like kind of tapping into that animal self and that truth that is beyond all of these different concepts that we and roles that we live in as socialized modern humans. And it allows us to tap into that sense of awe, possibility, and creativity, which is the child mind, you know, is the one that's totally open, that's not dealing with all of these fixed structures. And if we kind of tie this conversation back to the beginning, it's like, how do we break the rules of business? I think it's like we do play a bit more. You know, when I think of Stephanie's product around with Kana, like it does open, it's more heart opening. It's a place where you can actually try a new state of awareness, a new state of being, and practice it. You know, the plant will help you with the possibility of it, and then it's up to you to practice it in your life. So yeah, I guess I think that how do we break the rules? To me, you know, after all of this said and done, I see more play would be my my way of bringing this full circle.
And your eyes are sparkling as you say that. I see it. And both you, Stephanie and Alan, I just play come into your lives? Are you carving out space, time for both boredom and also maybe play emerges or imagination?
I definitely need more play in my life. That's for sure.
Mm.
Never enough, in my estimation. The way I like to do it, that makes sense for me in my life, is travel. Is taking myself out of the norm and being exposed to a whole other culture, language, people, food, and that is super fun for me, especially if I'm going with friends and we're just like discovering things together. We're like coming against our own preset, presumed notions of what we expected versus what it is. And just having that being disrupted is really healthy and also fun. And just not take life too seriously. I think that's a huge part of it. I will say, to be perfectly honest, it's challenging when right now I'm in the second year of our startup, and it's intense. I think breaking the rules of business, back to that again, and bringing in more play. What I've consciously cultivated is a group of us, the whole team, that we work and play together. We are not just like ticking the task list, and but we're also sharing some really powerful experiences together. For example, every year we actually do a company Kana ceremony together. And that's, sometimes asking a lot, because it's like, wait a minute, what are you asking me to do? We have a hierarchy here, and you're my boss, and I'm supposed to be vulnerable with you. And you know what? I just send the invitation out, and people show up, and it's amazing. Like, everyone shows up, and then there's some on the fence, and they're like, well, you can observe. And they're like, okay, we'll come and we'll just observe, right? But it doesn't matter, because it's modeling. I think that's really important, is especially in business, and especially in businesses going forward. I think that's really important, because it's recognizing humanity, and when we're coming together, instead of having this sort of, oh, I'm hiring you and I'm using your talent and I'm paying you, I'm giving you an exchange, but really what I'm doing is I'm just taking, right? But what are you getting out of it? I don't know, and I don't care. So this is an invitation, um, and trusting also that people will still show up for work. It's not like, oh, you're treating me like, oh, we can play together. Well, guess I won't work anymore. And I have never had that situation. And the more that I have found, respecting um, people's, I know, getting to know all of my employees, getting to, playing with them, having fun with them, and working hard together, they're actually more willing to work hard. It's kind of simple, but it's powerful truth. And so I try to bring that into work. So even if I have to work a lot, I still have that fun. But this is just this session is a reminder that I need to travel a bit more. I just need to break out of my circle even more.
Give yourself some of your own words of
Yes.
wisdom. I love that.
Yeah, I think just telling huge lies is a great thing to do. Just, starting a conversation and just kind of talking complete bullshit, and then just kind of seeing where that goes. I have a friend who would go, often goes to the hairdresser and just invents a different person to be to the hairdresser. And I think they have quite good fun with it. And yeah, and to an extent, I mean, I'm kind of often not really telling big lies, but, so often putting myself in positions where I have no idea what I'm talking about. And I just have to sort of see what happens. And that kind of feels also quite playful. And I deliberately do that. I mean, I'm a painter, writer, and to an extent, my process there is just to start something with some sort of intention. But the practice for me is to hold the intention very lightly, because it's usually pretty boring, and to see what else comes along. And I think that, to an extent, is an imaginal or an imaginative process, to set something in motion, but to be open to what pops up, what sort of nudges at you and says, "Hey, take a look at me. Much more interesting than that thing you were going to do," and then attend to that. And my work, with my company Weave, is to establish a global network of learning labs tackling complex problems. But a lot of it really is convening groups for conversations where we'll all be, like I'm putting a group together for the Venice Biennale, and we'll have a conversation there. And in my imagination, I'm thinking, oh my God, when Xiaojin Wei meets, Alice Oswald and, Brian, I'm imagining something, and that's super exciting. But it is really, really limited compared to what will happen. And I actually have to park that intention. But I'll get excited about imagining what could happen and curating and convening these encounters. And that's so exciting. And, I know that the feeling in me, the feeling of being excited, nourished, drawn towards these moments, that's something to sort of attend to and look after. But as I say, if I just kind of thought, well, right, I've imagined what the script could be, and Alice isn't saying that to Xiaojin Wei, so it's all going wrong, that would be really missing the point. So I think there's something there, maybe about play and imagination and sort of imagining something into the world, but also not being really wedded to that, because you'll miss
what you're
what's
saying,
revealing
Alan,
itself.
reminds me of not taking ourselves too seriously, right? Like improv theater, or at least having a healthy dose of improv theater, I don't know, every month or every year. Every single time I've done something like this, it challenges that part of me. And Zach, you touched on this earlier, this like autobiographical self, right? The part of me that wants to tell the story of me in this one specific angle of how I think I should be perceived, which in itself is probably a lie, And so it's quite interesting what you said there, because it made me chuckle. And I was like, wait a second. I don't want to tell people to say a lie, but then also it's like, yeah, playing with that a little bit can be quite helpful, especially not to take ourselves too seriously. And so this has been already a fascinating conversation. I do want to make sure we're kind of landing together. And Hope, please feel free to chime in any way. But I'd love to land together on a fun question. So if handling difficult conversations was an Olympic sport, what would be your signature move? Silence seems to be the group agreement.
Alan, go on, Alan. He's leaning in.
Well, I talked about, resonance and consonance. I didn't mention you earlier about dissonance, but I think, signature move would just be to listen really well first.
The art of listening. Yes.
Well, you've got to be prepared to say the dissonant thing as well, but I think, start with listening.
Well, that's been my learning very much. I think the thing that I would add to listening, and the way that you can confirm that you've heard for someone, is to reflect back, but not in a robotic kind of way, but to reflect back what it is that you've heard, what your interpretation is, and get agreement from them. Did I hear you right? To me, that is my, I would say that's my signature move, is did I hear this? Is this what I'm hearing? And did I get you right? As soon as I can get agreement there, suddenly, we're much further along in being able to find shared ground from a place of disconnect.
Yeah, if I could just briefly add, as soon as I said listening, I thought, yeah, but it's got to be an iterative back and forth. And you've exactly started to, sort of lay that out, Zach. So, did I hear you? Maybe I didn't. No, I completely got it wrong. Well, set that in motion, and that'll possibly elicit the same kind of attitude from the other, maybe.
What about you, Stephanie?
Well, listening for sure, but I would say always let the other person speak first and not to interrupt them at all, even if they go on nonstop for an hour, just let them speak. No matter how triggered you feel, no matter, just let them the whole way until they're done and feel complete. And, I love what Zach said, um, using that method as well, which is wonderful and important. And also just, I think, having that iterative process is important. But in the end, if, for example, this is a situation where it's about resolving the conflict in order to move on, towards the end, after, like, then of course I need to speak my truth and have them hear it, and kind of, we keep this process going simultaneously, on both sides, until we get to the point where, okay, but we do have to, come to that final decision. Then I would say the move would be, instead of, okay, well then blah blah blah, what do you think? It would be more like, okay, I hear you. From what you're saying, this is what I'm understanding what you're saying is, and you understand that where I'm coming from, da da da. What is it going to take for you to support this decision, as opposed to what do you think? So what is it going to take for you to then say yes to this, and go from there? And usually that is where I have found, then there is a conclusion, instead of like, okay, this is a never ending conversation.
What a life skill it is to embark on difficult conversations. I know for me, I do my very best to come at them with curiosity and openness. I might not have all the answers. I might not be right. Sometimes that's really hard. Coming to a potentially difficult conversation with curiosity and openness. And then, as I'm doing with all of you, looking at your faces, Zach, Stephanie, and Alan, and Julian, paying attention to what's not being said. I think there's languages that are happening all around us that don't come out of our mouths. And I think the cues of paying attention to other humans, especially when we're in dialogue, heated or potentially resistant dialogue, I think there is so much to pick up that could be woven into finding common ground or a resolution. So I'm definitely a feeler in that way. I feel my way in, and the words definitely they take a big role, but they're not front and center always. What about you, Julian?
My
What's your
Olympic signature move? I love those answers. Some of all of them at the right time. I think for me, what's becoming increasingly more important is to not censor myself and to allow the other person the same right. I think, when we want to be conscious of these narratives, as we started this conversation, of like the norms, of all the social hierarchy we could opt into, breaking the rules is just authentically owning where you're at today, right here, right now. You don't have to be right. It doesn't have to be something that's true forever. But when I don't censor myself, well, some people might not like it, but those who truly connect, who are in their heart, who are present in their own self, they know my truth isn't a threat to their truth, which I think is fundamentally one of the challenges in human relationships. And so, I could digress over that longer, but I think this is a good succinct way to say, I want more people to just live in their truth, speak their full truth, not self-censor, and break the rules, play with the rules, not by the rules. Now, given that we're not hurting others intentionally or at all, but emotionally feeling the dissonance at times is part of life. And I think it's really about building resilience and capacity with each other. And when we're all tiptoeing around each other or walking on eggshells, I at least know this for me, it doesn't create a lot of value.
No. And go ahead, Alan.
Yeah, well, just I really like that, Julian. It made me think. I can't remember who said that we're a verb, not a noun. We're a process. But I mean, even while we've been talking, it's daylight for you now, Zack, and it's nighttime for me. Suddenly it's got dark, and it made me think of just, I might start out in a conversation thinking, oh, this is my truth, but I kind of hope that the conversation might change that, and not just grip onto my truth. And the other person gets the chance to say theirs, I get the chance to say mine, job done. Rather, well, hang on, oh my God, maybe my truth wasn't my truth. Something's happened.
That's brave. And I'll speak for both of us, Julian and myself. What an honor it's been to spend this time with you, each of you, sharing your truth, exploring what's inside, and sharing it with us and the listeners in your inspiring way. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
It's been a great experience. I really enjoyed the flow of our conversation, the way that you convened it and held us throughout the whole experience. Thank you.
Thank you
for each of your contributions.
Awesome.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you for being great listeners.